thanks to those of you that are joining now. We'll probably just pause for two minutes. So we'll start at about 2 minutes past, 3 minutes past, just to ensure that we're getting everybody on the call and we're not missing anybody else. So thank you for joining, but we'll be silent for the next 2 minutes or so. Right, I think we'll make a start. So thank you everybody on the call for joining us. I'm just going to quickly run through the Zoom controls before we get started. So we're running it as a Zoom webinar. The chat function's open, so if you do have any sort of general comments, please put them in the chat. If you do have any specific questions though, put them in the little Q&A box that you can see there that I've pitched on the screen. We're going to go through sort of all of the panelists in order, and then we'll do a roundtable discussion at the end. So the questions might stay in there until the roundtable discussion, but put them in there and we'll have oversight of them. So this is the agenda for today. So my colleague Dr. Steve Millington will be doing an introduction. He's director at the IPM, and then we'll be going through all the panelists that we've got on the call today, which I'll let them introduce themselves when their time comes. But for now, that's it for me, and I'll hand over to yourself, Steve. So I believe you've got some slides to share. You can just share straight over mine. And unmute yourself while you're at it.
Well, I'll start off with the classic. Can you see the slides?
Yeah, we've got them, Steve. Clear.
Brilliant. All right. Okay. I'm gonna try and be brief. They kind of asked me to introduce this session and maybe raise some provocations. I don't know. We'll see how we go. The first question then is where is the middle? Where exactly is that? So I guess for myself, what I'm thinking here is too often. I mean, when we think about high street regeneration, too often it's about big capital investment in creating new shiny things, a new public realm, but very little provision for the ongoing management and maintenance of place, and accordingly a lack of appropriate governance structures or policy instruments for the safeguarding of place. And this quote from Dempsey and Burton talks about place keeping as opposed to placemaking. So there's something to think about in the questions. Perhaps a more useful term, and I like this term, I think Anne Marcuson came up with it first, is an idea called place gardening. So if we take the example of the garden, if you think about creating a garden, it's not only about planning and design, but there's also a hidden layer of maintenance and labour, forward planning, a cyclical and routinized process of nurturing which never ends. And no matter how much time and effort goes into making a shiny new garden, it only takes one unkempt lawn to bring the whole street down. And unfortunately, over the recent decades, this is pretty much how we've planned our high streets and main streets, resulting in a fragmented and piecemeal landscape where the care and maintenance kind of stops at an invisible service line. Now, developers, to be fair, understand the value of public realm and placemaking. It adds value to their assets, but what they can create can be often over-determined and over-regulated. privately owned public spaces or pseudo public realm may be litter 3, but often comes with restrictions on access and rights and raises concern about social inclusion. But not all developers are the same, and some understand that site-specific and this piecemeal approach to placemaking can be undone if next door are not doing their bit. Placemaking has to be holistic, and there is value beyond profit for commercial developers to collaborate to generate positive place-based outcomes. A big however is that a key partner in all this is local government. And this is struggling in terms of resource and capacity to do the basics when there are so many other priorities. And the point here is Manchester's botched regeneration of Piccadilly Gardens illustrates placemaking cannot just be about design and vision. There needs to be more focus on the prosaic, everyday, and let's face it, downright unsexy business of place management. So it's not surprising over the last 40 years in the UK, certainly, attempts to regenerate high streets have fallen short. Perhaps only just now are places realizing that placemaking is not just about putting shiny new things on the high street, when it might be better for local stakeholders to collaborate and invest in a system for picking the litter up and making the place better for everyone. But in terms of governance, there are a few alternatives to, say, business improvement districts that are actually in operation. So the pandemic brought the challenges facing the high street to the fore, forcing places to act quickly in terms of supporting local traders and assuring people places were safe to visit. And during the height of lockdown, I wrote guidance and presentations about managing social distance in relation to the safe reopening of high streets. Now, in doing so, I quite liberally borrowed from the ideas of tactical urbanism. However, in doing this, the theoretical underpinnings, I made them deliberately opaque. And there's good reason for this, because they borrow quite liberally from the French Marxist philosopher Henri Lefebvre. I mean, for those who don't know, Lefebvre, he was concerned about how public space was becoming subject to control by the state to further private interests, how commodification was increasingly subsuming citizens into a system of consumption. And Lefebvre called for a defense of public space against encroaching commodification privatization, arguing such developments were stripping away place identity and eroding the sensual and emotional qualities of place, notions of enjoyment, fun, and play, for instance. Or as sociologist Richard Sennett echoes, places where we might just sit in quiet contemplation to cry or to grieve without the distraction of being sold something. And like Jane Jacobs, Lefebvre was concerned about suburbanization, the displacement of urban populations at the time of his writing through state-led mass redevelopment, with particular vitriol about the sensuous qualities of place, how they were becoming disrupted and ultimately destroyed by growing levels of traffic. Now, despite its complaints about the privatization and loss of public realm, many places do retain bundles of it. It's just that the land is given over to vehicles and parking. And so Lefebvre and later the tactical urbanists called to reclaim the streets. And it's interesting to see how it took a global pandemic to convince municipalities about the value of removing traffic and parking from high streets and town centres. So rather than focusing on just what is good for the economy, Lefebvre calls us to think about places in all their aspects, drawing parallels between artistic and creative practice and placemaking, to think beyond the world of work and consumption, and for a collective engagement in transforming place. And in doing so, he argued there are opportunities to resist and reshape dominant place-based narratives, to recapture qualities of place and reconnect them to people. And perhaps this is something we need to do in relation to high streets, to move beyond thinking about them as places in decline or simply as places to shop, and instead redefine them as centres for the community, for public good. Who are they for? Ultimately, Lefebvre challenges us to do something about it, not just talk about it, to change the world and to change place by offering solutions to urban problems. And he draws on a process from biology called transduction to address everyday problems through a cyclical and iterative engagement. And this was later adapted by Mike Lydon and Andy Garcia in their book, Tactical Urbanism. And they simplified it as build, measure, learn, and calling us to experiment, to learn from our mistakes, make evidence-based decisions, and accept placemaking as an initiative and ongoing process. And acknowledge that the inhabitation of places is something real, and the problems people face every day in the here and now, not just in the long term. So the meeting in the middle then is this is echoing Lefebvre, is for planners and academics to come together and mutually solve the problems of place. He calls for planners to be more utopian in their thinking, not drawing on the assumptions of what makes a good society, but instead revealed through the studies of everyday life, how people use place, its rhythms and routines, and focusing on what makes people happy and playful. But there's also a challenge here to the academy, how it might more engage effectively. Too often academics speak to themselves, where knowledge remains confined to inaccessible journals, or where ideological dogma produces a paralysis. One thing we learned from the pandemic was that we just couldn't sit around waiting for revolution to happen. Instead, places needed to do something immediately. And I think the other side of this is that we might avoid over-romanticized imaginations of places comprised of self-organizing community collectives all working together to make their neighborhoods better. As the pandemic also demonstrated, some communities became empowered to act and others were left silent. And no matter how well organized community networks might be, they would find it difficult, for example, to construct a sewage or clean water system or build railway infrastructure. The strategic and statutory powers of the state remain important, and if we didn't have them, we'd probably have to invent them. So maybe this is where place management sits, at the interface of this kind of wider structural authority and processes, and the complex base of multiple users of place. And hence the Institute of Place Management calls for place leadership, a notion of leadership which is fluid and networked, and which requires skills in conflict management, consensus building, and managing all these multiple relations, or put simply, the interface between strategy and action. And there are bigger challenges to come. Climate change mitigation is one of them. We might nudge places in a process of adaptation to make them more sustainable. So yes, we need action now, but it's important not to lose sight of the long-term view in terms of place transformation and making them better. And that's the end of what I'm going to say.
Thanks, Steve. I'll just intersect at this point because at this point on the agenda there was Dr. Cara Courage, who is one of our senior fellows at the Institute of Place Management. But unfortunately, Cara is unable to make the session today because she's fallen ill. And this session is all about the Routledge Handbook of Placemaking. And the panel that we've got next coming up that we're going to go through individually have all got a chapter in that book. So firstly, I'm going to go to Sarah. And Sarah, if I could just ask you to introduce yourself and you know, where you're based, because obviously you're not based in the UK. So just to explain that and just give us a bit of a run through of your chapter. So thank you.
Okay. Hi, good morning, everyone. What an honor to be here. I am Sarah Calderon, and I am currently located in New York. And I am really coming from the point of view of more of sort of creative placemaking, creative placekeeping. I really like the place gardening. I hadn't heard that term yet, Steve, so that's, I love hearing all the place options that exist out there. And I was the former managing director of Art Place America. And so I'm sort of coming from that viewpoint, and definitely from the US. So I'll probably switch between high streets and main streets as we go through this. And most of what I'm thinking about is very US based. So forgive me for that, but I will hopefully learn quite a bit from my other panelists this morning. So I think my job here is to give an overview of sort of the chapter that I worked on with Eric Takashita and this sort of current state of things, right? So we started writing this chapter at the beginning of the pandemic about the future and the future of creative placemaking. And so I've reread it recently, and it sort of holds up, but I think there's a lot more to be said at this point. So I should also say that I think some of what I will say won't be rosy given where we are now, but hopefully there are some silver linings that we are seeing in this work. So I think if you look at main streets in the US, in our cities that are really, especially in our cities that are really comprised of neighborhoods with distinct main streets, where community members meet and congregate, socialize, eat, learn, explore, build, play, come together as community. They are mostly mom and pop businesses in the US. And many, especially in cities, are immigrant owned, and they really help define our places. In fact, one promising legacy of COVID might be the greater primacy of the neighborhood, right? Culturally and economically. As people venture out, they are choosing smaller stores to go into. They are moving locally. They are working from home, avoiding public transportation and crowds, and really trying to support their local communities. There's also a greater demand on outdoor spaces. So in local parks and different neighborhood amenities, as well as a focus on biking, right? So as Steve referred to, sort of open streets and outdoor dining has taken over many of our cities, with the needs of pedestrians and small businesses elevated over cars and trucks. But COVID really has left no main street, at least across the US, untouched. And because it's ravaged communities of color most of all, the businesses owned by these communities have also been devastated, right? So we know that there's been this major impact on small business owners, on employees, on resources, and on the support networks, and on the expectations and outlook. The US response to this work, the Paycheck Protection Program, was really supposed to support a lot of these businesses, which really employ almost half of the nation's private sector workforce. But in practice, for some, it arrived too late. For others, it was implemented poorly, and for many, it was inaccessible, right? And so in New York, for example, just 43% of the eligible businesses received a PPP loan, at least by the end of last June. And we're still, in the US at least, expecting about 13% of these small businesses to close. And not only are the small businesses closing, but that also affects the tax generated revenues, everything that's supporting public safety, schools, parks, and other community service as well. So at the same time, we've had sort of this devastating, I'm continuing with the negative here, but I'll get to positive soon. At the same time, the arts and culture sector has really been decimated across the US, right? 11% of arts and culture organizations are reporting that they probably won't survive. 2/3 expect severe financial impact, and performing arts companies alone have experienced a 54% decline in revenues. In the US, at least 27% of musicians were unemployed, but in some places this number was as high as 72%. And so overall, 20% of the employment losses were in the arts sector, basically. But of course, the arts are adapting, right? They always do. They've moved to virtual and to outdoor venues, and relief funds have flowed, but have been rather insufficient for many. So the arts and culture field has also called for programs that support artists' employment and wages, leaning on the history of what happened during the Great Depression with the Work Progress Administration, and later the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act in the 1970s. And so these programs, in addition to guaranteed income pilots that are springing up across the US in San Francisco and St. Paul, Minnesota, soon to be in New York State, are figuring out how to move artists into this, arts and culture workers basically into this larger federal, hopefully soon to be federal policy work. And so similar to previous crises, the COVID-19 has created an opportunity to advance creative placemaking as a tool. And this is what Eric and I really sort of argued for, that particularly as community well-being becomes an urgent need and focus, arts and culture can be a tool to help bolster community in places. And so there are some ways that we think that it can do this. It can help us imagine the future. So it can open up sort of our ability to creative problem solve, to think, to evoke empathy, and provide immediate attention ideas to solve issues. The idea is to, if we could use this in a proactive way, right? We've been very reactive because of the immediacy of the issues that we're facing. Thinking about arts and culture as tools to help us innovate proactively instead of reactively, we believe could be helpful. We also think that it can help advance equity. So it can really help communities heal from trauma, both the pandemic, the racial uprisings that have happened, and the racial attacks on individuals and communities have really created quite a bit of trauma across, at least across the US, and I believe across the world. And so looking to arts and culture to support us so that we can understand who's benefiting from the work that's going to be happening in the immediate future, and then how we're being inclusive as we move into a new world. We also believe that arts and culture can help us build stronger relationships. So there was just a social cohesion and its connection to arts and culture and healthy communities paper released by Metris Arts Consulting and Policy Link. And it sort of leads the way, or sort of demonstrates how arts and culture can help build social cohesion. And then finally, this idea that that arts and culture can help us support cross-sector collaboration and impact, right? Steve, I think, mentioned sort of this holistic way of thinking about things, and cross-sector solutions can be a holistic way to do some of this. And creative placemaking is really inherently cross-disciplinary, right? It can transform spaces, activate places, generate economic development, generate regenerative jobs, make streets safer, transform community identity, nourish communities who have experienced trauma, and so many things. Something that happened during COVID was this ability to lift restrictions in a very quick way. And so this idea of lifting these restrictions so that this cross-disciplinary, cross-sector work can happen has been really promising as we move forward. And then I think I'll just say finally, creative placemaking, at least in the US, was established as a federal policy in most ways in response to sort of a societal crisis, our financial crisis in 2008. Not that it wasn't happening for many years before, I should say. But this, this idea of this a crisis leading to innovation is how creative placemaking was sort of brought to the forefront and created more of a growing field. We're hoping can now happen again. So that's it. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Really interesting insight there. Thank you. Okay, next on the panel discussion, we've got James and Andrew, and we're keeping with the American theme, as you're also based over the Atlantic. So if I could just ask you to introduce yourselves.
Great. James Lima, I'm the president of James Lima Planning and Development, based in New York City. We're real estate, economic, public policy advisors, worked at the intersection of public and private sectors, and are really focused on the economics of placemaking. My colleague Andrew Jones and I co-authored a chapter in the handbook titled "Placemaking as an Economic Engine for All," and I'm just cover a couple of points. But let Andrew introduce himself first.
I'm Andrew Jones, also with James Lima Planning Development, based in Brooklyn, New York, and leading a lot of our work related to downtowns and commercial corridors.
So I really appreciated the comments that came before, and I'll just build on that. You know, a lot of the work that we do thinking about economic policy and advising downtown management organizations. We just helped create a new place management organization in the Southeast US, is really thinking about our experience of place as a key component of whether cities and towns will be successful in competing as communities of choice for those people who have increasing numbers of choices through, creating and maintaining appealing and welcoming experiences. And all of this is something that we've had to think in the last year, of course, in the context of seismic shifts globally in retail. The fact that the pandemics, had this enormous impact on the public realm, much of it good, but some of it complicated. And then certainly those of us in US cities, but remarkably watched it spread throughout the world, the reckoning with literally centuries of racist policies. And lastly, in the context of a real growing sophistication of place management organizations to really be the kind of governance and stewardship entities that can take on all of those things in ways that maybe in the past wasn't possible. And to Steve's point about place gardening or tending, I think of these place management organizations as the tenders and the choreographers. And so I think there's a really interesting opportunity to think about land use and zoning, about mobility, innovation, but really fundamentally about the human experience of place and the ways that we as designers, as engineers, as policy people, as academics, as users of these places, in a way, each one of us is an expert at place because we know what we like. Why do we go to the places we do? And when we're taking someone, to see that sort of pride of place district, we have a mental map of the loop we're going to take. And we're going to basically take a route that will guarantee there are a series of rewards along the way. And it's that thinking that we try to bring to district scale planning for downtowns, for high streets and main streets. I would say the kind of fundamentals for us is that, capital and investment follows talent, and talent follows place, although that's become even more complicated with convening technologies that have given us so much more flexibility. In my opinion, all the more reason why cities and towns and high streets have to double down on investments in place. Again, in the context of the shifts in retail, which is kind of like a foundational part of the experience of high streets. How do we address the fact that retail is now less product-based and more experiential? And if we take a cross-section across a typical high street, you've got the public realm of street right-of-way and sidewalks, but you've also got substantial amounts of space indoors in public and private buildings. And if you think about that entire cross section as a new opportunity, a new way of thinking about how we can better leverage these assets that we have that flow not only through a district, but across streets, particularly toward greater equity objectives. And I think the kind of foundational question of who are these places for can be confronted and addressed by thinking about those resources. As traditional retail retreats from the brick and mortar spaces along those high streets, it's actually an enormous opportunity for new cultural and other uses that can both reach a broader set of audiences, to be more welcoming and inclusive to broader groups of people. But in places where we're working that have really suffer a deficit of social infrastructure and cultural infrastructure, which we argue is the underpinning of an innovation economy. In places like downtown Calgary, which is a cowboy town energy economy that realizes their central business district, Main Street of Stephen Avenue, is not supporting and competing for the kind of talent and investment that they need to continue to grow, and now realize they must diversify their economy. How can arts and culture and this changing nature of that cross-section of that high street be an opportunity to create a richer social and cultural infrastructure that supports a knowledge and innovation economy in ways that our traditional high streets have not? And again, how can the place management organization, adopt these values and continue to grow in their own sophistication to be an important player in a city's overall economic growth or economic recovery strategy? How are we helping in the choreography and curation of the experience of place in ways that attract and retain increasing numbers of people in the civic commons, but in ways that are welcoming and more diverse and hopefully more interesting? And with that, I'll turn it to Andrew.
Thanks, James. Just to build on a few of the key points made there, I think there's an opportunity for place management organizations to adopt a lot of these broader equitable economic development strategies that have proven successful in ensuring that places are inclusive and accessible. One is kind of incentivizing or even requiring that local residents and small businesses be prioritized for some of the kind of job or procurement opportunities created by place management. Engaging youth, particularly those from underrepresented groups, for educational and work opportunities associated with place management, and then capturing some of the value that we know that high quality public realms along high streets and main streets create, and redirecting it to some of these objectives, such as affordable artists and creator space, social infrastructure, to James's point, as well as affordable housing creation and preservation, or even access to capital for small businesses. Another point I'd add is that the pandemic has presented, a possible future for what our high streets and main streets could look like via some of these open streets pilots. And while, some of the initial studies have shown that these have created a lot of value for small businesses and even been integral to their survival, there's some kind of important questions around place management that they've raised. Concerns around the privatization of public space, to a point that Steve noted. And while there are benefits to kind of the tactical nature of some of these, the kind of expedient nature of them didn't really leave time for robust community engagement processes, and left some feeling that there were concerns unresolved around accessibility and the like. I should also note that the ongoing management of some of these open streets programs has heavily relied on volunteer time and volunteer resources, and this has created kind of a correlation between the success of some of these open streets and the income levels of the surrounding community, which obviously has equity implications. Another thing that I think we should kind of discuss in the economic context is the role of e-commerce. E-commerce was already kind of deteriorating, the business communities along our main streets and high streets before the pandemic, and it's only kind of exacerbated since. So I think there's an opportunity for place management organizations to kind of help these businesses become quote unquote omnichannel, i.e. both, operating in digital and physical spaces. Could they help them, develop digital ordering systems or even shared logistics and distribution infrastructure that would enable some of these small businesses to kind of compete and survive? But again, this requires investments in some of that fundamental infrastructure, as well as a real focus on equity to ensure that some of those minority and immigrant-owned small businesses are featured here. And then even more broadly, digital platforms like e-commerce and rideshare are kind of transforming the way that people and goods move through our main streets and high streets. And how do we, redesign these spaces to kind of address some of these changes, whether that's designated, logistics and delivery zones or for higher vehicle pickups and the like. And I think there's even an opportunity to use, sensor technology to kind of study and improve the ways that we observe and measure, and then improve the management of our spaces. So just a few points to add there.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And from there, I think we'll head straight into Sean's presentation. So over to you, Sean, who's based in the UK.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And actually, thank you, Andrew and James and Sarah as well for kind of great provocations there. Actually, Andrew kind of I'll hopefully be building on some of that stuff about the sensor technologies, because that was what my chapter in the book actually dealt with. So very opportune. I've got a couple of pictures to show, so I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully this works. Can you all see that? You can see some big pictures. Okay, great. So yeah, I am based in the UK, in Newcastle upon Tyne, and I'm completing my PhD on young people's participation in society, looking at how we might be able to use digital technologies to design and support the design of better places with children and young people kind of at the centre of those and their views. For my research, I worked and I've been working quite a lot with youth groups, group of young people who come together to tackle particular issues such as the environment or homelessness. And I've also been working in elementary schools and primary schools as well. For my chapter, which I co-authored with R.A. Poussar and Clara Crivellaro, who are both based at Newcastle University with me, I was asking how we might be able to start engaging children and young people with the sort of sensor technologies that Andrew kind of referenced, and with some of the kind of so-called smart technologies that are being deployed in cities, often without citizens' knowledge or consent, often for more nefarious purposes as well, as I'm sure we can all kind of imagine. What we did is ran a schools engagement with a primary school class in Newcastle to actually give them the tools to be able to gather the kinds of data that these smart city tools are gathering themselves. So if you imagine a portable version of air quality sensors, as this one is a traffic sensor, so it can actually sense the speed of oncoming traffic. It's used for baseball more ordinarily, kind of how fast your kind of swing is. But this has been appropriated as a tool to be able to measure the speed of traffic. And the point of kind of doing this was with 8 and 9-year-old children. The point of doing this was to try and understand how they might be able to be involved in tackling their exclusion from placemaking, and how they might be able to gather useful and productive data that they could then use to design better places and support the city council processes of designing better places, which was taking place in their neighbourhood. The chapter kind of and the work which has been ongoing in my PhD has really given a window into the possibilities that the greater agency that children and young people could have in designing technology, designing cities, and actually rethinking their position, not as vulnerable, excluded actors who have no say or have no capabilities to be able to contribute, but rather as useful and valuable in terms of their participation, kind of assets for and partners in city making. That's the key, really. It's the kind of not necessarily turning things over to think, what if children design the city, but rather how do we partner with children and young people to make better cities that benefit everyone. And we've got a long way to go, as you might expect, before children and young people are even recognised as having this kind of social competency to be able to contribute to processes like placemaking, place management, place gardening. I love all of these terms, but you know, to actually think of them in that way, there's a long way to go. But the kind of work that we did, I think, really shows the potential for that. So if you haven't already got a copy of the handbook, you know, please do, and please do read that chapter, because it is hopefully a really good insight into that possibility. I kind of wanted also to respond in particular to the topic of this webinar, and thinking, you know, who are high streets for, and how does this relate to the high street? You know, why do young people need to actually take action, and why could they be taking action in this way? And why should we be thinking of youth when we're thinking about high streets or the main street? I mean, coming back to James's point around how we're experts in the places that we use, the places that we inhabit, and we experience, young people are no exception. And historically, and often still today, although this seems to be changing, young people aren't involved in these kinds of processes. You know, thinking about the question, who are high streets for? I mean, I just will show a couple of pictures that came to mind for me when I was thinking about this question. So, you know, this is legitimised dwelling in cities, right? This is, you know, what we're encouraging now as placemakers, whether we're in commercial or in the public sector. You know, we're thinking about how can we make cities experiences for people. But the first thing that come to mind for me, and whenever I walk around the city like Newcastle, is, you know, these places aren't for children. These places aren't for minors. They're spaces of consumption, they're spaces of capitalism. You know, usually drinking alcohol, which obviously those under 21 in the US can't, those under 18 in the UK can't. So they're immediately excluded, you know, not only just from the fact that they can't even if they wanted to, but rather, you know, this kind of exclusion of not being able to afford to do this. What child is going to be able to afford to go to a fancy restaurant like this? And so we legitimize these kind of experiences, but I like to think about, well, who are these experiences for? You know, when we're thinking about experience-led placemaking, who are we thinking about when we think about these experiences? And actually, when we do think about children, young people hanging around the city, we think that they're a nuisance. we clear them off. You know, it's devices like this, which is called the Mosquito Alarm. If anyone's heard of it, this is actually in Philadelphia, I think, this picture. But it's used quite widely. This emits a high frequency noise that only children and young people, about those under 25-year-old, can hear. And it's intended to clear them off from places where they shouldn't be loitering, where they shouldn't be hanging around. I think when I was looking in Philadelphia, actually, they have these would you believe in playgrounds. They've installed these in playgrounds. So even where, and this is to stop them hanging around at night, but even when we're thinking about, well, here's a place that we're telling young people have to go, you know, we're delineating the space for children and young people, will go to the playground, don't hang around the city centre. Well, we're clearing them off there too, so they can't win. They're constantly in a losing battle. And you know, if the future of our high streets isn't shopping, it's experience, then I really just want to kind of leave you with the question of, you know, who are these experiences for? We need to be working with children and young people to understand more how they use the city, instead of trying to kind of control and regulate their use of the city and tell them and prescribe the ways that they should be using the city. Go to the playground, go to the skate park, go to your designated space. And obviously, even worse, I mean, this is, you know, just one example of COVID. Obviously, the playgrounds have been closed, but you know, it can get more nefarious than this. It can get more sinister than this when we're kind of restricting people's movements in the city. We're restricting the rights to protest, to gather. I mean, there's so many examples. I don't have time, but there's so many examples I could give about how this is now happening over the world, and it's quite scary. and is affecting young people as well. So we need to be thinking about how we can challenge this and how we can do this different. And actually, the one thing I kind of want to leave you with now, I'll be kind of wrapping up in a second, but we need to also be looking at where this is already taking place and where young people are already doing valuable work to kind of challenge their position in society, and really elevate the kind of activism that they're already doing. I mean, this is just an example. So in the chapter, we talk a lot about air pollution, and that's the focus of the kind of sensing technologies. And obviously, air pollution is a big issue for main streets and for high streets. I mean, this is one very obvious example, maybe, of London in Oxford Street. This is arguably London's high street, and it is, you know, one of the most polluted streets in the city. But actually, what one group in London have been doing, a group of young activists based in South London, young activists of colour, have actually been taking matters into their own hands and been challenging the notion that air pollution is not an issue, and actually trying to make this more prominent. So Choked Up are a group of 17-year-olds mostly, who are studying in school at the minute, but have decided to set up a group to really raise this issue of air pollution. And this is one sign that they've put up in South London. If you can see, breathing kills is what it says. So it kind of challenges that idea of, and actually really draws attention to communities of colour who are more disproportionately affected by air pollution and by the bad environment that's being created by those who are, you know, who are usually white. I actually would argue and put a provocation here that I think groups of young activists like Choked Up are actually helping to save our high streets. They're making them more sustainable places. And they're not only raising this profile of a massive public health issue we need to tackle, but actually ensuring that our high streets and our main streets remain places for people and not just for cars. So, you know, the high streets and the main streets of history have always been places to gather. They've been political spaces for the exchange of goods, of ideas, of people, and they really reflect the values, I think, main streets and high streets reflect the value of the cities that we want to create. And now these high streets and these main streets are under threat from all sorts of forces, not just online shopping and changes in shopping habits, but the political restrictions I was kind of hinting at as well. So what cities do we want to leave our children and young people? What cities do we want children and young people to inherit for the future? And that's kind of the question I want to leave you with. How can we work with children and young people to understand the kinds of cities we should be making, the kind of high streets and main streets we should be making? And in our chapter, we show one way of going about this, but obviously there's lots of other amazing work, and I encourage you to kind of check out Choked Up and lots of other groups happening in London, probably across in the US as well. So let's support this work and kind of work together to think about how we can create better and more inclusive cities that work for everyone. Thank you, that's all I wanted to say.
Thanks very much, Sean. That was a really good perspective there, especially around the debate around young people, which I think a lot of the speakers already have covered that point. So it's a really good point to think about for the discussion as well. So thank you for that. So the final speaker, on our panel, before we go to a bit more of a roundtable discussion, we've got Kim Cook with us. So Kim, if I could just ask you to unmute yourself and just introduce yourself and introduce your chapter a little bit as well.
Thank you. This really dense, rich, beautiful material already being shared. It's very nice to be here. And my name is Kim Cook. I am part freelance, part director of creative initiatives for Burning Man. I have a practice where I also do creative direction of projects in placemaking, spectacle, original performance work, and then consulting on the funding and philanthropy side to small nonprofit leaders in the arts and culture sector around their capital structure, their financial wherewithal, and so forth. So that's me. I'd like to start back where Steve started with this picture of meeting in the middle. And probably most of what I talk about in my time will be partly the things I think about anyway, and partly the things that came up for me while listening to my colleagues who had so much important information to share and whose chapters I very much enjoyed reading. Nothing like being on a panel to get me to do my homework. So it's good to be here with you. When you talked about meeting in the middle, Steve, the thing that came to my mind is where's the middle? And that we tend to think of the middle as being equidistant points. And we're often talking about systems of asymmetrical power in terms of capital and policy and ownership and governance, you know. So meeting in the middle might be 90%, 10% to equalize these things and to receive the useful information and inputs of our community, such as Sean was just talking about. So I found that idea of meeting in the middle sort of provoking and interesting. And then along these lines of placemaking, placekeeping, place gardening, place management, all words that I heard today, and how placemaking, even as Sarah said, was a sort of response to the Great Recession here in the States, at least in the elevating of that terminology, the commissioning of Anne Markison and Anne Godwin Nicodemus to write the paper for the National Endowment for the Arts, start the Art Town Fund, you know, assemble 14 arts investment, you know, foundations and challenge them to put together the pool of money that became Art Place America. That was, you know, really, I think, sort of building on the work of Richard Florida and Charles Landry, observing that there was a strategy to be made there, and it's economic, right? When Roberto Bedoya and others start talking about placekeeping, they're talking in many ways about recognizing that there are pre-existing assets in community, often indigenous or you know, long-term residents of a neighborhood, often people of color, and often the value creation there is being overlooked. And then place gardening is interesting because in a way it sort of abstracts us from the origin story of economics or, you know, indigenous or, you know, local residents, and puts us in the now, where are we and how do we tend a thing? The thing about gardening is you both plant seeds and pull things, you know, so, and then place management comes full circle to me in this kind of like, oh, how do you sustain it? How do you think about it? And it just, listening to y'all made me think about how profoundly complex these things are. And the place management piece in particular for me means you need to include all of those interests, right? The economic, the indigenous, and those who are, you know, cultivating or growing from what is in this kind of cross-sector strategies between, you know, public health, between educators, between residents, and so forth. I wanted to share a couple of examples that I think are really interesting around this. I also wanted to suggest that when we talk about high streets or we talk about main streets, we tend to talk about central urban cores, which James, your writing talked a lot about the sort of density and the benefits of density. I also think about smaller neighborhoods. So for example, in Venice, Italy, if you go to the Nova Strata, you're not necessarily going to be buying from urban indigenous or cultural makers of Venice. You're probably going to be buying from, you know, a lot of retail people doing knockoffs of the things that we think of as being culturally Venice. And so the exploration of the hyperlocal and smaller neighborhoods, I think of Neal's Yard in London, where I was told I absolutely had to go, are also really important sort of nodes of how we come together and are can be welcoming and special surprises. Philadelphia is actually a super good city for that. When I first was there, I thought it was like all brick and hardscape. And then gradually you find these sort of hidden corners and courtyards and, you know, what we now would call parklets, but were founded in the 18th century as a little square with just camellias in it. So I also think we have to think both the central core and the smaller nodes inside of places. Some of the examples that, just for listeners who may or may not know these, I thought of the city of Bologna in Italy has since 2014 had collaboration pacts that citizens can sign with the city that empower them to take on local action related to the commons, which I think is a very interesting practice. And I don't know a lot of other precedents around that. I thought about Karin Leckberg in Sweden, Alby, actually just outside of Stockholm. She's resigned her position, but for 25 years, she co-founded and led Subtopia, which thinks about mixed use and really not the way mixed use conjures up in our minds. It's public gardens, it's light industrial car, you know, repair, it's costume and photography, fashion design, circus. And she placed an emphasis on the value of immigrant populations to communities and how new knowledge, new strengths, and new vocabularies come into play when you welcome the immigrant. And Albi happens to have, they speak like 54 languages there. It has a very, very rich immigrant community that's typically thought of as an encroachment, in which she has fostered a sense of value there. And she's asked people to rethink about what a shared vocabulary means. So, for example, a non-Swedish speaking resident who can be a real car mechanic, when the job description says you have to be fluent in Swedish, she challenges whether that's the vocabulary you need to repair a car if you understand the mechanics of a car. And you can translate that same idea to any number of kinds of things where we set standards of what we want. And even Sean, with your work with children, that there's supposed to be some sort of level of adult competence in order to make a contribution, when in fact that's not the case. So the interrogating the standards and the norms and the barriers, the forms with which people are expected to comply, I think is really important. I also thought of the work of Emmanuelle Haas in Paris. She leads something called Sema Est, and that work is around looking at the sort of artisans of Paris and how not to have a homogeneity in what is offered. And they deploy capital and they deploy, you know, capacity strengthening support to a wide range of diverse artisans and culture bearers of Paris, and in particular with an emphasis on sort of the 19th arrondissement and areas of African diasporic residents in Paris. Super interesting work. Also to mention Maud Lefloc, who is Palau des Arts Urbisme. My French accent just fell apart, but she works with architects and developers to consider how artists do site-specific work and then translate that into the process of development decision-making, so that people who live near a place that are going to be developed get to participate in sort of the creative exploration of that place, and new pathways, new designs, new systems for the development emerge from her work. So I've named a number of examples. There's just a couple of more I wanted to say. One is about these large retail, and we've talked about the sort of impact of e-commerce and turning them into experiences. And if you look at the Market East Gallery in Philadelphia, they've really translated those large spaces into experience zones with something called Wonder Spaces, which is sort of installed art and immersive stuff. But more importantly to me, an organization called Rec Philly, and it's REC, but it's kind of a double entendre. And it's a real, it's a recording studio, but it's also a place of innovation and social incubation and very participatory, membership driven transformation of space and place in Center City, Philadelphia. The couple of last thoughts. One is, someone mentioned about affordable space for cultural spaces, and I am right in the middle of doing coaching for organizations that are performing arts organizations in the Bay Area as they rethink their capital structure, their business model, given the events of the last couple of years. And a few of them have free spaces, and I always put quotation marks around free in space. And so if we are going to think about making affordable spaces, we have to think about the full cost of those spaces, because if we give a company, a theater company, for example, a free space, but they still have to pay for the build out of the space. If we give another company a free space that has 40 years of deferred maintenance, if we, if you, think about what is free and what does it take and how does it change your operating model if you have a free space, but you have to maintain it. And, I think about in New Orleans, one of the things that we saw after the Katrina, and I was the president of the Arts Council of New Orleans post-Katrina, but one of the things a council member said to me there is that the capital moved faster than the policy could. So all of the things that deploying a whole bunch of capital could have done, even when it came to learning from the Dutch about living with water, were very difficult to implement because the capital moves so fast. And so we saw the Treme Community Center have a computer lab with no computers in it and no one to teach people to use the computers. We saw libraries that had been single story become 2 stories. And so you need more staffing that the library didn't have the operating budget to do. So when we think about space, we really have to think about what we're doing there. And what I think I've managed to cover all of the points that I wanted to make. There was such a rich contribution of everything that came before. And then, who has the knowledge and how do we glean it? And I think about Ghana Think Tank, who have done really interesting work about going to, so-called underdeveloped countries or communities at risk and ask them to solve so-called first world problems. And, where we glean our intelligence and where we get our information, coming full circle to what I said about what does it mean to meet in the middle, I think means finding and innovating new ways of communicating, really be willing to have shared vocabularies. My lexicon, my paradigm may not be the one that's going to be the most useful in a situational way. Moving into the nooks and crannies of our neighborhoods and fostering and nourishing those without overemphasizing central downtown cores. I'm not saying, not minimizing their importance. I'm just saying we tend to neglect the hyper-local in this kind of conversation. And then finally, I loved in both Sarah's chapter and Sean's chapter, you talked about where we derive information and, who we talk to, and the power of story and listening just really can't be overstated, because the kinds of interventions we might make in public space, the sort of acupuncture points in our cities, can come from the most unexpected places. So thank you very much for letting me share.
Thank you, Kim. You rounded that off really nicely there. Thank you. Before I go to Steve, I know Steve's got quite a few discussion points that he would like to potentially debate. I know this is Steve's favourite topic, so I'm not surprised in that at all. We do have a few questions in the Q&A box. So, Sean, there's one here for you, but there may be perspectives from other people on the panel as well. It just says, do you have any recommendations about effective strategies for capturing younger people's views and voices about the future of the high street places? As you know, this can be a bit of a challenge. For instance, have you any particular research methods that have worked well and that others could learn from?
Yeah, thank you so much, Chloe. I think that's a great question, and it's funny. Whenever I've done something like this, I do usually get asked that question because it's quite elusive, I think, and I think people are often a bit nervous about engaging with children and young people, and indeed this may actually apply to other communities as well. You know, how are they going to allow me access? How are they going to feel? How would I communicate? Kind of what you were saying, Kim, you know, how are we communicating with these maybe harder to reach or kind of at risk potential communities? So there's kind of there's a couple of toolkits I can put in the chat. So there's the kind of very practical, pragmatic answer of here are a few good toolkits, which I'm very happy to share after this. But then there's the kind of the kind of more holistic answer, which is actually we maybe just need to kind of not think too much about particular ways of speaking or particular methods, but actually just engage with them as we would engage with any other child and young person, you know, being open, asking them, you know, how they feel about something, actually asking them in the first place, which is not many people do that in the first place. You know, meeting them where they're at is usually the phrase I always use, meeting them where they're at. So are they in schools? Yeah, we'll then go to the school and meet them there. Don't expect them to come to the city council and read the 100-page planning document that you've got there, or, you know, understand the schematics that the architect put up in the chambers or anything like that. You know, actually try and work to translate what we're doing in practice, whether we're planners, architects, even community workers, translate what we're doing into something that is relevant and meaningful for them. And, you know, Kim, I'll build on you again, but, you know, stories, I think, is a good way of doing this too. You know, put it into a story, put it into a narrative, something that they can connect with. But also important to say, don't assume that they won't understand as well. It's important to not assume too much and also think, well, they're only young, they're never going to understand this language. Maybe they will. So it's about trying, not being afraid to fail, and being open and engaging with them as much as you possibly can. But I'll put those practical toolkits in the chat as well, just to respond to that.
Thanks very much, Sean. I don't know if anybody else from the panel wanted to intersect at this point. I'll just pause.
I could say that in New Orleans, we actually had Art Place America funding. Thank you, Sarah and Jamie and all the good people there, for a project called Youth Solutions. And the premise was that we could do a number of things in one. One was we could work on design education for youth so that they understood the built environment as a social construct comprised of, you know, sort of, do they have food? Do they have access to parks? Do they have education? And do they have places they feel safe? Do they have access to medical care? That kind of thing. So we taught them to be able to interrogate their own neighborhood. This was sort of 14 to 18-year-olds, I would say. And then we paired them with artists and architects so that they could propose solutions to their own neighborhoods. And the idea here was also that we were dealing with a lot of trauma in the youth. If you imagine, you know, 5 years or so ago, that the teenagers of New Orleans were, you know, 4, 5, 6 years old during Katrina, so had a lot of trauma. And trauma, one of its hallmarks is learned helplessness. And so the premise there was that if you could look at the built environment, which seems immutable, come to understand it as a social construction, and then go ahead and do the sort of intervention and to build things, that it is cognitive dissonance with learned helplessness when you can actually impact your neighborhood. But what we also did was work with public health officials and researchers to look at the qualities that are sort of analogs between social emotional wellness indicators in sociology and what artists naturally do around story circle storytelling. And one of the ways that we measured that, coming to the sort of more tactical side of this, is that we use Post-its. And so, you know, we let kids self-report in the morning, like where their heads were at, and self-report in the evening where their heads were at, as a way to also evaluate the impact we were having or the time they were spending together and how it was altering their relationship. And then, so I think, you know, looking for the indicators and looking for how we measure that can also be playful and fun.
Thanks very much, Kim. Sarah, I don't know if you wanted to come in. You did post a very interesting link in the chat, so I don't know if you quickly wanted to mention that.
Sure, just Art Place before it closed at the end of 2020 put together this sort of field scan of the intersection of youth development and creative placemaking work, in case it's helpful, with lots of examples. And I think what a lot of this boils down to for me, I do a lot of arts education work, but is just the trusting of youth, right? It's a lot about sort of handing over power and handing over trust. And coming to, I think until you understand what their potential is to contribute to this work, it's hard to get your head around it, as I'm sure Sean can talk for hours about.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah. There's a good question here from Michael, which is probably something that the whole panel can relate to. And he just said, though it would be interesting, I'd be interested in any thought around the small high street versus the internet. He says that in his practice at the moment, it dominates most of the discussions from a bit of a point of inevitability and despair. So I'd just like to throw that out there first. First, I'll go to Andrew and then to James, and then ask if anybody else has any opinions. So Andrew, I don't know if you can pick that up.
Sure. So one of the things that we've seen over the course of the pandemic is that business improvement districts have been collaborating with technology companies to help their local retailers and restaurateurs build out functional websites with e-commerce capability, and that's been essential to helping them survive, you know, as that's been the only way to kind of purchase things over the course of the past year. And I think scaling up and kind of replicating some of these programs and having it be adopted by more place managers is a good place to start. But I think there's also, as I noted, kind of a physical infrastructure piece to this as well, right? Distribution infrastructure is not something that a small business has the capability to kind of develop on its own. So it could be something that, you know, a bid could use a share of its assessment capital budget to create and to enable, you know, these businesses to compete in a digital marketplace. Anything to add there, James, or other panelists?
Yeah, James, I don't know if you'd like to pick up.
Well, I would only add that I think high streets need to be much more about our coming together as a community and for more diverse experiences and less dependent and focused on traditional retail. And I think the networked governance that we've talked about is really the public and private and philanthropic sectors. It's the property owners, it's the merchants, it's creative arts organizations coming together and finding, you know, opportunistic moments along those corridors.
Maybe a point that I'd like to add there is that, you know, is it as depressing as the headlines make out, and is it as sort of inevitable that the internet will take over small high streets? Is that inevitable, or, you know, is it a different picture in practice? I'll throw that out to anyone. Maybe Steve, I'll go to you. I know you've got an opinion on this.
Short answer, no. If it was, then why Amazon about to open 3,000 convenience stores worldwide? There's a value in bricks and mortar. There's a value in people going into an actual real shop. Amazon realized that because they can upsell and add value to what they do. It's got to be hybrid. That's the future. The problem is, when we think about retail, a lot of our retailers, the big ones, didn't adapt quick enough. And the challenge is a lot of our smaller independent traders are only just now waking up to the realization that they can be both online and offline, and there's a value in both of that. And I think what was really interesting, because we do work with the social media analytic company, Maybe, and they've shown during the pandemic, you know, people's use of social media increased exponentially because there was nothing else to do. business use of social media declined. Makes no sense. And those businesses which were communicating, big and small, with their customers, with their local catchment, are the ones who picked up business and ticked over. So I think it's a fruitless, it's a false paradigm. It's a false opposite to say the internet's killing the high street. The internet is part of ongoing dynamic change. We kind of we've all embraced it. We wouldn't be having this now if we weren't for the internet, this conversation, because we're all online in different countries. So it's I think if there's a piece of work to be done, it's around upskilling market traders, local businesses, get online, get a presence. And as we've done in many communities, is encourage a bit of ownership over branding. Don't give it to a consultant. Do it yourself on social media and put out a cohesive message. Let people know what the offer is when you're open, run events. It doesn't cost much time or business to do. And I think that's a bit of work that everyone on the call, a lot of our practitioners on the call, could encourage on foster.
I think a relevant issue is how will high streets continue to get support for reinvestment, and some of it is funding related. How do we continue to get government funding to support the continued infrastructure investments and the like? And I think the key from our experience is relevance. And so that diversification and this notion that the future is hybrid means place management organizations need to become even better partnering organizations. How do we bring the local talent you have to the place, create more ownership and involvement in the place? But also, I think as we look at benefit cost analyses, they tend to be very quantitative around very specific metrics related to money and what we think of as economic value. And I think it's critical that we learn to be more increasingly qualitative in thinking about health and wellness, about urban design, historic preservation, the mental health benefits of community connection and open space. And so I think there are a lot of policy alignments that governmental investment in high streets could achieve that are not traditionally thought of as those kind of commercial corridor investments.
If I may just add a very quick point as well, and potentially an obvious point, but it can get lost in this kind of debate, but not everyone has access to the internet. And not everyone who has access to the internet has the ability to, have a credit card, to be able to pay for things online, have an account, have an address, have all of these things that actually a lot of us will take for granted that we require. If you buy something on Amazon, the amount of details that they require in order for you to buy something. Now, most people could probably manage that, but it will be the marginalized people in society who can't, who have to go down to the store. So we have to think about ensuring that, whenever we talk about these kinds of things, we're inclusive as well, and we're thinking about who maybe are we excluding, and also it's still important then to push for, these little kind of high streets and little main streets too, because these are often, in the locations that these people can access. Not everyone can afford the bus fare or to drive into the city centre. In some cities, it's miles and miles to the urban core. So it's still, I think there's still a real place for these kinds of local neighbourhood streets, and there will continue to be for years to come.
Thanks for that, Sean. I don't know if anybody else wanted to intersect on that point before I'll just go to Steve to do a bit of a summary of everything that he's thought of today. Steve, over to you.
Okay. I had loads of difficult questions, which I was scaring the panelists with, but I think we'll leave some of them. Just to pull together some strands and themes. I think one thing I did put in the questions, which I didn't ask, was like a takeaway for everyone. And I remember going to a session at a conference a few years ago about the concept of managed retreats. There's papers about coastal communities which were inevitably going to disappear into the sea because the land was disappearing around them, and a lot of really interesting working geography around nostalgia and memory, but also managing the process of managed retreat, basically whole towns and villages which we just let go, and how that process is dealt with. And I think when it comes to high street, we talked a lot about place keeping and community assets and what's valuable to communities. That's great and fine and important for identity and so on. But they have to adapt as well. Otherwise, we've got a crisis on high streets and main streets because there are no shops on them anymore. So they need to change. So how do we manage that process of letting go? Some things do need to be let go. And it's difficult, and I think that calls for a lot of interest in qualitative work, working deeply with communities undergoing kind of structural change. So that's one miserable thing to take away. I think other things to think about. I was like, things I've really picked out today. I think the point come up around, there was lots of barriers to change, which during the pandemic suddenly disappeared, and it became easier to do more interesting stuff on high streets and main streets. And that's, and this is down to authorities and regulations. And it's something I banged on for ages. Lots of things people in power could do just to make it easier for people to do stuff and therefore take ownership of doing stuff, which doesn't actually call for big funding or massive investment. It's simple change in bureaucratic process. So that's one takeaway. To add to the lexicon of place things, place stewardship, that's another great idea that the people who are invested in power and do make decisions and do have their capital, they're custodians of that place, not the owners of it. And I think that's a really important concept to deal with or to think about. Oh, and I've just lost my notes. I like the idea as well, just a very specific point about the porosity that we've got. This is going back to Jane Jacobs, for porosity on the high street, reactivating storefronts, and creating, reducing, that kind of, barrier between the public and private, and creating. And we've seen a few examples of meanwhile use and pop up this and pop up that, but how could we really genuinely, through community assets, maybe, I don't know, or through benevolent landlords or whatever that process is, to facilitate that. I think that I really like the point Charles made around legitimized dwelling, and therefore there must be illegitimate dwellers as well. Add to that rough sleepers, older people, but ethnic minority groups and all sorts, other people and you see some of the calamitous measures put in to reopen high streets, like really clunky barricades, which weren't friendly for people with wheelchair users. And I think there's, when we start to think about, certainly the practitioners on the course start to think about more reflexively about what they do, how the unintended outcomes of some decisions we make quickly can reproduce these kind of dominant understandings of who the user of the high street is. And I think, just to add to that, just a little anecdote on that, sometimes we fetishize what younger people want about the high street, and that leads us to put in playgrounds, or we fetishize what older people want from high streets and we put in a Zimmer frame. So stop using these stereotypes, just go and talk to them. We interviewed some young entrepreneurs, 15-year-olds, and they said the biggest barrier for them coming into the high street was the bus fares. They were too expensive. So we sometimes get carried away about what people want, and it's often the solutions are quite prosaic and ordinary, and we can do something about them. I really like the point, meeting in the middle does not necessarily mean equality. We need to think about equity, and the shift in the power balance, as Kim suggested, is it's not a 50-50 thing. We might need to go some extra and create some bigger boxes, so communities who are left behind can stand also and look over the fence. I suppose another concept that came up in the discussion, I think it's taking much more hold in Europe now, is the idea of the urban commons, and thinking through what kind of partnership structures or governance structures we need to manage. And I think treating the high street as a common would be a fruitful way forward. And I think ultimately, and it's something we bang on again and get at the IPM, that communication, place communication, is not just about sending out messages. It's not just about place marketing and branding. Use communication to listen. Listen to the users, listen to residents, listen to people, and construct alternative narratives, which are genuine, participatory place branding, I suppose. And I suppose that's where I'll leave it, I think. Unless anyone wants to totally refute what I just said, I don't know.
Yeah, it's just at this point whether anybody had any key things that Steve's missed out there that they wanted to add to the thoughts, or what they'd learned from today from the panel. Don't know if anybody else had anything.
I think just the last point that you made, Steve, about listening, it sort of prompted me to think also about the role of data and how we situate data gathering and from whom and where. So much of the case to be made for access to capital requires data support. And I think that it's important to be creative about where we source the data, how we source the data, and how much we can do that on a participatory basis. There's a guy named Brian Lee in New Orleans who has a little studio practice called Co-Locate. And for years, he wanted to do this thing he called, I think he called it the spot. And it was a sort of a taking containers and repurposing them and using sort of puzzle pieces and interactive devices for people to come in and just name what's going on with them in ways that allowed you to get super hyper local input about the state of things. And so the data collection processes, I think, can become ever more creative in terms of where and how we source the data that informs our work.
Thank you, Kim. And there's a point there from Sarah as well.
I think, yeah, I thank you, Steve and Kim. I think just a couple of things. One is sort of the letting go versus making sure that we're bringing people along, right? That we're actively making sure that people are able to change and able to move forward with everybody else, so that we're, just thinking about that, I think, is really important. And then related to that and to the comment by Kim in your last piece, Steve, this idea of making sure that the people who are making the decisions are the people who we are listening to, so that we're not just listening, but we are bringing the youth to the table, the decision-making and power, the structures of power table, that we're bringing BIPOC communities to that table for decision-making, and that if we want youth voice, that we're bringing them at the place where decisions are made. I think that that's important.
Yes, and I would say we have to fund that work, because too often the interlocutors and representatives of communities, to someone's earlier point about relying heavily on volunteers, I think that was you, Andrew, is that we also don't fund those, there's I say we, but I mean a sort of institutional idea that we're bringing something great, we're bringing the capital, we're bringing the the ability and the access to resources, and therefore you, the community, are just going to be grateful. And Veronica Castillo Perez, who used to run Raíces Culturales in Philadelphia, was very clear when the Philadelphia Ballet wanted to bring free classes into North Philadelphia, that she would like free access to their audiences as well. And so this, back to what you said, Steve, about, equity is different from this sort of equidistant, and so we really have to, I agree with you, Sarah, completely. These communities need to have decision-making power, and we also need, access to resources in their hands and not just deployed at our sort of post-colonial missionary mindset kind of way. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much there, Kim. So yeah, we have actually come up to time now. So it's a time to sort of bring it all to a close. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank all the panel and thank you to Sarah, James, Andrew and Kim for sparing us your morning, quite early morning as well. And obviously thank you to Sean for sparing us some time of your afternoon, and obviously to Steve for chairing. And just to note that the Routledge Handbook of Placemaking is available, and it is on sale and is available online. Or
you can buy it from Amazon.
Yeah, you can buy it from Amazon, or hopefully it's available, you know, in your local library or academic library if you're related to an institution. So thank you very much, and we'll probably pick up this discussion as well in maybe another event, and hopefully Cara is recovered by that point as well. So thank you very much, and good night, good afternoon, good morning. Or
Thank you.
Thank you
Very
very much.
stimulating.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
Bye.
all.